there's a version of intelligence most people have completely wrong. It isn't the man who can recall every fact at a dinner party, or win every argument, or always have the sharpest comeback in the room. That version of smart is loud, and it's usually compensating for something. Real intelligence is quieter than that, and it shows up less in what a man says than in the handful of things he's disciplined himself to never say at all. Over years of watching people, some of it through Stoic philosophy, most of it through simply paying attention to how people actually behave under pressure, one pattern keeps repeating. The men who earn quiet respect, the ones people trust without being told to, don't waste words. They don't rush to fill silence just because it's uncomfortable. And there's a short list of phrases you will almost never catch them saying, because they've learned, often the hard way, that these particular sentences don't just sound bad. They actively cost you something every time you say them: credibility, growth, control, or time you don't get back. Here are 7 of them. Not because the men who avoid saying them are flawless. They aren't. Nobody is. But because they've paid the price for these words once, noticed the damage, and quietly stopped. 1. I already know that. This is the one that slips out fastest, usually before you've even decided to say it. Someone starts explaining something, and a reflex fires before their sentence is finished. I already know that. It sounds confident. It might even feel efficient. Why sit through an explanation you don't need? But listen to what the sentence is actually doing underneath the surface. It isn't describing your knowledge. It's closing a door, and it's doing it in front of the one person who might have had something to add that you genuinely didn't have yet. I think about a specific evening years ago, working under a mentor who'd clearly earned the right to talk less than everyone else in the room. The kind of person whose silence had weight because you knew it wasn't empty. We were walking through a process I'd done 100 times. He started explaining a piece of it, and before he'd gotten 2 sentences in, I cut him off. Yeah, I know that already. He didn't argue. He just gave me a look, calm, but with something heavier underneath it, and moved on to the next thing. It wasn't until that evening, replaying the exchange, that I understood what I'd actually done. I hadn't just interrupted a man mid-sentence. I'd taken something away from myself, the chance to hear what decades of doing that exact process had taught him that no manual or training video had ever captured. Whatever he was about to say, I'll never know, because I decided in advance that I already did. That's the trap hiding inside. I already know that. It isn't really a claim about information. It's a claim that there's nothing left worth hearing. And the moment you believe that about any subject, you've quietly closed the door on ever learning something new about it, no matter how many decades of experience are standing in front of you offering to hand it over for free. There's a version of this that plays out constantly in workplaces, and it's worth naming because it's rarely this dramatic. It's small, and it compounds. A junior employee starts to explain a new tool or process to someone more senior, and the senior person waves it off with some variation of, yeah, I've seen this before. 6 months later, that same senior person is noticeably behind on the exact update the junior employee was trying to walk them through, because the update wasn't the version they'd seen before. It had changed, quietly, while they'd stopped listening. The junior employee, for their part, learned something too. Don't bother explaining things to this person twice. That's a real cost, and it's invisible until you're the one paying it. The Stoic framing on this is unusually direct. Marcus Aurelius pointed out, essentially, that you cannot learn anything the moment you've convinced yourself you already know everything worth knowing. What he was describing wasn't a fact about intelligence. It was a fact about ego. The need to appear knowledgeable, to protect an image you've spent years building, becomes the exact mechanism that blocks you from ever updating that image. It feels like solid ground. It's actually just pride, dressed up convincingly enough that you mistake it for competence. I once watched a carpenter, genuinely one of the best I've come across, decades into the trade, listen with total patience to an apprentice explaining a technique the carpenter had almost certainly mastered before the kid was born. He nodded, asked a real question, thanked him for walking him through it. Afterward, I asked why he hadn't just said he already knew all that. He said something that stuck with me since, because sometimes you learn more from how someone else sees a thing you thought you already understood. That's not modesty for its own sake. That's a working method, a way of extracting value even from a conversation that, on paper, had nothing new to teach him. So the actual discipline here isn't pretending to be ignorant. It's this: the next time you catch the thought "I've heard this before" forming, take the extra second and listen anyway, not to humor the person in front of you, but because there's a real chance you catch something you'd have otherwise missed, a detail, a different angle, a nuance that sharpens what you thought you already had fully figured out. And even in the rare case you learn nothing new, you've practiced something valuable regardless. Humility, patience, the kind of quiet respect that makes people want to keep talking to you rather than around you. 2. That's impossible. Years ago, I worked alongside someone I'll call Robert, sharp, experienced, exactly the kind of person who looked like he was carrying an entire company on his shoulders without visibly straining under it. He also had a phrase he reached for almost automatically. Anytime a new idea came up, entering a different market, overhauling an outdated system, taking on a difficult client, his response, nearly every time, was the same 2 words: "That's impossible." At first it read as prudence. Somebody has to be the realist in the room, right? But watch that phrase closely enough, across enough repetitions, and a different pattern starts to emerge. It was never really describing the situation in front of him. It was describing Robert, his own limits, his own fear, projected outward and relabeled as objective analysis. Seneca made an observation that fits this almost exactly. We suffer more often in imagination than we ever do in reality. That was Robert's actual operating mode. He wasn't running the numbers and concluding an idea genuinely couldn't work. He was running a private simulation of failure, the embarrassment of being wrong, the risk of trying and coming up short, and then presenting that simulation as if it were a rational forecast. It's a quiet kind of fear precisely because it doesn't look like fear at all. It wears the mask of caution, of practicality, of being the responsible adult in the room. Underneath the mask, though, it's the exact same mechanism that keeps people small. The belief that if you can't see the entire path to the end, you shouldn't take the first step of it. I got a direct, personal version of this lesson on a project a few years after working with Robert. Tight budget, an unreasonably short timeline, a team that was, by any fair measure, inexperienced for what we were being asked to do. Every instinct I had said this couldn't be done. But instead of saying it out loud and stopping there, I tried something different. I asked what was actually within my control today, and what the smallest next step forward looked like. That project turned into one of the better ones I've been part of, not because of some miracle, but because we refused to let the size of the challenge paralyze us before we'd taken a single step toward it. We just kept finding the next move, then the one after that. Marcus Aurelius put the underlying principle plainly. You have power over your mind, not over outside events. And that distinction is the whole difference here. The moment a man says, "That's impossible," he's declaring defeat before anything has actually been attempted. What most people label impossible is usually just unfamiliar, not a wall, but a challenge they haven't yet reframed as a series of steps. Strength, in the Stoic sense, was never about winning every attempt. It was about showing up again, particularly when the odds looked stacked against you. That's the real content of Stoic courage, not blind optimism, but disciplined persistence, one controllable step at a time. There's a specific version of this that shows up in startups constantly, worth naming because it's so visible in hindsight. Founders get told that's impossible by people with more experience and better credentials constantly, right up until the moment they've actually done it, at which point the same critique quietly gets revised into, well, obviously that would work. The gap between those two reactions was never new information. It was somebody finally taking the first step instead of declaring the whole path unwalkable from a distance. 3. That's not my fault. Few sentences do more quiet damage than "that's not my fault." It's deceptively simple, and in the moment, it usually feels completely justified. Something's gone wrong, at work, in a relationship, somewhere in life, and the instinct to defend yourself, to make it clear the blame sits elsewhere, feels almost automatic. But here's what that instinct costs you every single time you act on it. Responsibility and power travel together, and the moment you push one away, the other goes with it. A friend of mine, I'll call him Michael, lost a major client a few years back, and he had a ready explanation for exactly why it wasn't his fault. The client was difficult. The market had shifted under him. His team had missed a few deadlines along the way. Every piece of that was, to some degree, true. But while he was busy building the case for his own innocence, something else slipped away entirely unnoticed, the opportunity to actually learn anything from what had happened. He stayed stuck, repeating close variations of the same mistake on the next account, convinced each time that the failure belonged to someone else's column. What he never seemed to register was that by refusing to claim any share of responsibility, he'd given up the one lever he actually had control over, himself, and what he'd do differently next time. Epictetus's framing on this cuts straight to it. It isn't what happens to you that matters, it's how you respond to it. When you say "that's not my fault," you're effectively handing the power to fix the situation to whoever you've decided is actually at fault. You're waiting on them to make amends, to change, to do better, while you sit on the sideline of your own problem. The moment you accept even a small, honest piece of responsibility, something shifts immediately. You go from passive to active, from waiting on someone else's move to making your own. I've noticed this directly in my own experience, that owning even a small part of something opens doors that staying defensive never does. Sometimes it's as unremarkable as admitting a message could have been clearer, or that I could have prepared better going into something, even when other people involved clearly made larger mistakes than I did. That small willingness changes something internally, and it changes how people trust you externally too. It signals you're not someone waiting to be rescued or proven right. You're someone who acts. Blame is the easy move. Responsibility is the hard one. But responsibility is also, reliably, where the actual leverage lives. There's a version of this worth mentioning that shows up in customer-facing jobs specifically. A support rep who says, "That's not on us. That's a policy issue," every time a customer is upset tends to have a short shelf life in that role, not because they're wrong about the policy, but because they've made themselves useless in the one moment a customer actually needed someone to own the problem. The rep who says, "Let me see what I can actually do here," even when the underlying issue genuinely wasn't their doing, is the one customers remember, and often the one who gets promoted, because they demonstrated the only thing that was ever actually in their control, their own response. 4. I don't need any help. Of all 7, this might be the one dressed up most convincingly as a virtue. "I don't need any help" sounds independent, strong. The kind of thing a culture that celebrates the self-made lone operator has trained most of us to admire on sight. Underneath it, though, is usually something considerably less heroic: pride, quiet and corrosive, convincing you that struggling in silence is a form of strength rather than a slow erosion of the exact resilience you think you're protecting. Look at Abraham Lincoln during the worst years of the Civil War, and the popular image is almost always the solitary, stoic figure carrying the weight of a fractured country alone. What that image consistently leaves out is how deliberately Lincoln leaned on other people. He built a cabinet out of men who openly disagreed with him. Historians later nicknamed it a team of rivals, specifically because he valued perspectives that contradicted his own, not despite his confidence, but because of how he understood wisdom actually gets built. During the brutal standoff at Antietam, he made the trip to visit a general he had real friction with, purely because the man might have strategic insight worth hearing. None of that reads as weakness in hindsight. It reads as strength that happened to be measured in humility rather than isolation. The Stoics were explicit about this too. Marcus Aurelius, arguably the single most powerful man alive at the time, spent part of his private writings simply cataloging what he owed to his teachers, his mentors, his friends, crediting specific lessons to specific people by name. The most powerful person in the Roman world did not pretend to have arrived at his own understanding alone. It's worth sitting with the fact that if he needed other people's input, the rest of us almost certainly do too. And yet the belief persists that asking for help is a quiet admission of defeat, that reaching out means you've failed to be strong enough on your own. That belief is a trap, and it isolates you specifically inside the problems you were never actually built to solve alone. There's a cost on both sides of that transaction too, one that's easy to miss. When you refuse to ask, you're also denying the people around you the chance to actually give something. You cut off the exact kind of mutual exchange that holds relationships, professional or personal, together in the first place. I've been on the inside of this trap myself, carrying work and family and the pressure of appearing to have it together all at once, convinced that keeping it together meant keeping it entirely to myself. All that actually did was wear me down quietly, over time, until the point I finally told someone I trusted that I couldn't manage all of it alone. What I got back wasn't judgment. It was understanding and real support, and that one moment of admitted limitation gave me back clarity I hadn't had in years. Real strength, it turned out, was never about how long you could stand alone. It was about knowing precisely when to reach a hand out and when to take one being offered. 5. I'm too old for that. This one arrives quietly, often disguised as practicality, sometimes even wrapped in self-deprecating humor, so it goes down easier. Underneath it, though, sits something heavier, a resignation, a belief that the best chapters have already been written and there's little left worth attempting. It's the kind of thinking that closes doors long before there was ever a real reason to close them. Consider Harry Bernstein, a man who spent his working life as a magazine editor, raised a family, and at 93 years old decided to write his first book. He called it The Invisible Wall, a memoir about growing up in a divided English mill town. Several publishers turned it down before it finally found one. He was 96 by the time it reached shelves. It went on to real international acclaim, translated into multiple languages, and he wrote 3 more books after that one. Harry never bought into the idea that he'd aged out of contributing something new. He had something to say, and the fact that he was in his 10th decade of life didn't strike him as a disqualifying detail. What's actually notable about Harry's story isn't the eventual success. It's the specific courage underneath it, the willingness to believe there was still more to learn, create, and offer, while past the age most people quietly decide they're finished. That choice isn't reserved for exceptional people either. It shows up as an ordinary daily decision for anyone. Do you listen to the voice insisting you've already missed your window? Or do you work from the premise that as long as you're breathing, there's still something worth doing? The Stoic position here is unambiguous. Age, in itself, means essentially nothing about the state of a person's mind or purpose. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself constantly that death was inevitable, not to be morbid about it, but precisely because that fact sharpened his sense of urgency about how fully he lived until it arrived. Wisdom, in this framing, isn't a byproduct of simply accumulating years. It belongs specifically to the people who stay curious and willing to be a beginner again, at any age, rather than the people who merely got older. I've watched men in their 60s pick up entirely new trades, start businesses from nothing, take on mentoring roles for people decades younger than them. I've also watched others let years of accumulated regret quietly convince them to retreat from anything unfamiliar. The difference was never really about circumstance. It was mindset. A man who says, "I'm too old for that," has already shut the door before checking whether it was locked. A man who instead asks, "What can I still do now?" has, without any extra qualification required, kept it open. 6. I'll do it later. Few phrases feel as harmless in the moment and turn out as costly in hindsight as "I'll do it later." It sounds rational, a promise to yourself that you'll circle back, eventually, once things settle. The uncomfortable truth is that later tends to function less like a delay and more like a graveyard, quietly holding most of the good intentions that never actually got acted on. I knew a man, I'll call him Thomas, successful by nearly every external measure, a thriving business, a close family, real standing in his community. He was also, chronically, too busy. He kept telling himself he'd spend real time with his aging father once things at the office calmed down. The fishing trip they'd talked about got postponed. The catch-up call got pushed a week, then another. The visit where they'd just sit and talk kept sliding to soon. Then, one day, later ran out entirely. His father died suddenly, and Thomas was left holding a phone full of half-written messages he never sent, and a long list of things he'd meant to say and never got to. He told me this himself, years afterward, not looking for sympathy, but as a direct warning. You think you have time, right up until the exact moment you find out you don't. The Stoics were unusually blunt about this. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself, in writing, on a near-daily basis, that he could leave life at any moment, and that the fact should shape what he did, said, and thought right now, not someday. That wasn't an abstract thought experiment for him. It was closer to a working practice, a mindset built specifically around the fact that time isn't actually under your control, no matter how confidently you plan around it as though it were. There's a version of this that shows up constantly in ordinary, non-dramatic form. The message you keep meaning to send an old friend, the apology you're waiting for the right moment to deliver, the project sitting half-finished because starting again feels harder than it should. None of these carry the same stakes as Thomas's story, but they run on exactly the same mechanism, waiting for ideal conditions that were never actually a prerequisite, and quietly trading real, available time for the comfort of postponing discomfort. I've done this myself. Conversations delayed specifically to avoid the discomfort of having them, and every time I finally stopped waiting and just acted, the weight of the delay lifted almost immediately, replaced by a clarity that the waiting had never actually been protecting. 7. That's just how I am. This one sounds like a simple statement of fact, almost a full stop at the end of a sentence, but listen to what it's actually doing. It's a quiet surrender, a decision to stop growing, dressed up as self-knowledge. Intelligent men tend to avoid leaning on it, because they've internalized something most people would rather not examine too closely. We are not fixed. Who you are on any given day is the accumulated result of choices repeated over time, not a permanent trait sitting underneath them, immune to revision. Watch how this plays out in practice. Someone loses their temper often, and when it's pointed out, shrugs it off with, "That's just how I am." Someone else avoids anything resembling real vulnerability and explains it away with, "That's just who I've always been." These aren't neutral descriptions. They're excuses constructed carefully enough that fear and simple inertia get to pass themselves off as honest self-awareness. Underneath both is the same resistance to the discomfort of actually changing, and to the plainer truth that no one is ever really finished becoming whoever they're eventually going to be. Epictetus made the underlying point directly. It isn't events themselves that disturb people, it's their judgments about those events. The same logic extends cleanly to identity. It's rarely your actual nature limiting you. It's the story you've decided to tell yourself about your nature, repeated often enough that it starts to feel like a fixed fact rather than a habit you've simply never questioned. Change is genuinely uncomfortable. It demands real self-examination and a willingness to let go of the familiar, even when that familiarity has, by now, become its own quiet source of pain. But the Stoics treated self-mastery as close to the highest calling available to a person, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary for a life that actually meant something. That requires a specific, harder question, asked honestly rather than rhetorically. Am I behaving this way because it's genuinely who I am, or because it's simply easier than doing the work required to become someone slightly different? The men who consistently choose the second, harder path tend to understand something the rest miss. Wisdom was never a trophy you win once and put on display. It's a practice, repeated daily, not because you hate the version of yourself standing here now, but because you respect that version enough to keep building past it. If you caught yourself somewhere in these 7, good. You're in exactly the company you'd expect to be in, because every one of these phrases is common precisely because it's tempting. The point was never to arrive at some flawless version of yourself that never says any of them again. It's simpler than that. Notice and choose differently the next time the same phrase starts to form. So, which one actually landed for you? Maybe it's the relationship you keep telling yourself you'll finally leave, or the retirement you keep pushing to when things settle. Maybe it's the message you'll send later, before later quietly becomes never. Whatever it is, that recognition is the actual invitation here. Not toward perfection, but toward staying curious, staying willing to be corrected, and continuing to move, one deliberate choice at a time.